Hello everybody, I'm Den Haring. Welcome back to my channel, Fish Den 365. I hope everyone here had a happy Easter. You know, I was thinking back on my channel for the last few days and it occurred to me and it just amazed me that I have not done a video on lipless crankbaits yet. And that is extremely surprising because I love fishing lipless crankbaits. I think they're fantastic under the right circumstances. It's probably some of the most, for lack of a better word, magical bites that I've ever had fishing these baits. Now, there's times when you're not going to catch fish on these baits. It's just not the right thing to throw. But when the time is right, in the right circumstances, it's one of the best baits, one of the hottest things you can throw. And I've probably had some of the hardest bone-jarring bites on lipless crankbaits. So today, that's what this video is going to be all about. How to fish lipless crankbaits. So I guess when it comes to lipless crankbaits, from my point of view, I should start from the beginning and tell you my lipless crankbait story. You know, this was back in the 80s, somewhere in the mid-80s, where lipless crankbaits at that time, they get popular. This happens with a lot of baits. They get popular and then they kind of run their course and then they fall out of popularity. And then some time goes by and then they get popular again and they go through these cycles. And it was around the mid-80s when lipless crankbaits were going through that popularity cycle again. And I didn't really know how to fish them and wanted to catch fish on them. You know, I read all about them. I saw people using them on the fishing shows. So I knew that they could be effective. And yet, when I tried them, I just couldn't catch fish on them. And one of the things that I didn't realize is it was because of the way I was fishing them. I tended to throw them out and reel them back pretty quickly. And that's what a lot of people were doing in the magazines and what I would see on TV. And that technique, that method will work, but it's not nearly as effective as some other things that you can do with lipless crankbaits. And for me, it was just, I needed to gain the experience with the bait to understand how to really fish it. So my first experience where I caught a fish with a lipless crankbait was with this actual lipless crankbait, a Bill Lewis rattle trap. This goes back a ways. This is the most famous lipless crankbait ever made, the Bill Lewis rattle trap. It's very well known. It has a lot of BBs in it. Makes a very loud, pretty high-pitched rattle, and it's a very effective bait. And I found myself fishing one mid-October afternoon, weekday afternoon on Beltsville Lake. And if you're familiar with Beltsville, just above Preacher's Camp, there is a hump, an underwater hump. And I was fishing that hump, and I was throwing some different baits out there, spinner baits and others, and I couldn't catch a fish. And it was getting to be evening time. I probably only had about 45 minutes of daylight left before it would get dark. And I decided to pick up this particular lipless crankbait. It was colored like a crawfish. I threw it out over the hump and I let it go to the bottom. And I was actually digging up the bottom with it. And I remember being surprised because even though I was bouncing along the bottom on that hump, I wasn't getting snagged. The hooks weren't snagging. And it's partly because the attitude of this bait is actually like this when it's you know, coming through the water. And so I was bumping over rocks and that kind of thing, and then all of a sudden, boom, I had a really hard hit. And it turned out to be a smallmouth. It was over 18 inches, a real pretty fish, real beautiful smallmouth bass, probably 3 pounds, 3¼ pounds. It was good size, and it was fat. And it was my first fish on a lipless crankbait, but it certainly wouldn't be my last. And so my first experience was that. And that is a legitimate way to fish a lipless crankbait, and that is to actually bounce off the bottom with them. Now, the thing about that is certain lipless crankbaits go down faster than others, and the rattle trap is not one of the ones that is known for falling very quickly. And so if you're going to use a rattle trap to do that, then you want to use use that slow retrieve over fairly shallow. I mean, where the top of this hump came out 6 to 8 feet deep, it wasn't very deep at all, and I was just slow rolling this thing over the hump right along the bottom. But there are other lipless crankbaits that lend themselves better to bottom bouncing and that kind of thing, and we'll get into that as the video goes on. Right now, I want to tell you the rest of my lipless crankbait story, or at least more. So I got a fish under my belt on a lipless crankbait. It felt good. But certainly it wasn't anything consistent, and I still didn't really understand how to fish them. And so some years later, it was probably in the early 90s, I found myself on Mincey Lake in Northampton County. And I always launched from the eastern parking lot. And in front of that parking lot was a really nice, deep milfoil bed. You know, it was at least 8 feet deep, and the milfoil grew up to within about a foot or two of the surface. I found myself out there in June, and the milfoil wasn't fully grown to the top yet, but it was thick. And I had a different lipless crankbait. It was this actual one. I've done really well to keep some of these crankbaits, these liplesses that I've been throwing this many years. And you can see, if you look hard, you'll see that a lot of them that I show you are really beat up. And that's because when you find one that works, you don't want to let go of it, because they're not all created equal. I can buy 10 of these, 10 of this exact bait with this exact color, and one of them, in this case, this one, will just catch more fish than the others do. There's something about its vibration, its action, it's the rattle, something that the fish like better. And so when you get a special bait like that, you want to do everything you can to hold on to it. Anyway, I was out there, and again, I was throwing a spinnerbait, and I was out in Mincey. This was, like I said, back in the early 90s. And it was a time where we were catching quite a few fish on spinnerbaits. This was, again, in early June. We were making those spinnerbaits come through the weeds. And I was out there, and it was a fairly windy day. There was a good chop on the water, and I was throwing the spinnerbait, and I couldn't get him to go on that. And I switched to this. This is a cotton Cordell. This is actually a Jimmy Houston Excalibur spot. It's a cotton Cordell spot, but it's a special one. It's an Excalibur one. A little bit better paint job, but it's just like just a Cordell spot, just like this is. Same baits. You can see they're the same shape. Everything's the same about them. It's just these Excalibur ones were painted really nice. And so this has a little bit a different sound than the lipless crankbait we just showed you. Let me pick that back up. You hear that? Quite a bit different. Here's another spot. Let's just hear if that sounds similar. A little louder than this spot, but deeper sound than this one. Anyway, I was throwing this, and I was ticking the weeds with it. I was hitting some weeds with it, and I was kind of hitting the rod like this to rip it through the weeds. And it didn't take long. I caught a fish immediately doing that. And that is when I began to learn how to really fish a lipless crankbait, because that day I put a hurting on the bass with this one bait. And it was catching, it wasn't fishing anymore, and it was a great morning. As long as that wind blew, I was catching them on this bait, and it got to the point where I didn't even have to rip it through the weeds. I didn't have to let it get into the weeds. As long as I was just above those weeds, and I'd stop and go. I'd be reeling like this. Really fast, stop. Really fast, stop. A couple of times, stop. And so it was that erratic retrieve where this thing's coming along and stops and stutters and begins to tumble and fall. Then you go along fast again, it stops, and they would just slam it. And that is where it hit me about how to fish a lipless crankbait, because they just hit it so well and had it so far down in their mouths. I knew at that point that this is a bait that needs to be, more often than not, because it'll catch fish other ways too, more often than not, it needs to be fished erratically. That's the key word for lipless crankbaits. If you want to learn to catch fish on these, if you had trouble catching fish on it, fish them erratically. An erratic retrieve is what triggers the bite on this bait. That could be fast, it could be slow, but it should be erratic. It could be horizontally erratic, it could be vertically erratic, but it's got to be erratic. What do I mean by vertically erratic? Well, let's say you have one that falls much faster. This is a Lucky Craft LV 500, much heavier bait. This is a much better bait for having it fall to the bottom and then jigging it back up. Well, when you do that erratically. You might jig up twice and then back down. Jig up once and then down. So even that you can do erratically, and that catches fish too. But back to our story at Mincey. So we had a really good morning and learned a lot that day on Mincey Lake with this particular bait. Throughout those years in the 90s, I continued to fish lipless crankbaits, and I had days where I couldn't catch a fish on them, and I had other days where I slammed the fish on them pretty well. And so it was a pretty consistent bite for me at Nockamixon, at some of the Pike County lakes that I fish. Anywhere good weeds grew, I was able to catch fish on that bait, using it by ripping it through the weed beds, Mincey for example. And then somewhere in the early 2000s, I found myself on Rapala Lake, and I was throwing this. This is the actual bait It used to be much more chartreuse. It's actually gotten pale because it's been so beat up over the years. And it has a glitter into it. And this is a rattle trap. So again, it's got that higher pitch noise. And this one I actually had to tune because it used to run crooked. So the way you tune it is you just bend the line tie the opposite direction of the bait goes. So if the bait goes this way, you bend it this way so that it straightens itself out. So I bent that line tie, I got this thing tuned, and I started throwing this. And on this particular year, and I don't know, it was within the first few years of the 2000s, they had eradicated the weeds. They've never done that at Shohola. They did something where they just knocked the weeds down, and there were hardly any weeds in the lake. It was the oddest thing. And so you can get around almost anywhere you wanted to, which is difficult today on Shohola when those weeds are up. And so we were just kind of moving around, and we were looking for wood cover, stumps, and that kind of thing. And I started throwing this, and I was doing that same erratic retreat. 1, 2, 3, stop. 1, 2, 3, stop. 1, 2, stop. You know, that kind of thing. Every now and then just pulling the rod forward. And I was fishing with a buddy that day. And he didn't have any lipless crankbaits, and I kept offering them to him because I was just crushing the fish. And as I recall, he wanted to catch a fish on a spinnerbait, and he did not put that spinnerbait down. And, you know, by the end of the day, I had something like nearly 40 bass caught, all on this. I might have caught a few on a popper when the wind settled down some, but almost all of them were caught on this particular bait. And he caught one pickerel on a spinnerbait. He did not catch a bass. He tried throwing a lot of other baits. I kept offering the lipless crankbait, and he didn't take me up on the offer, and he didn't catch any bass. And it was a shame. But for me, it was one of the better days I had in Shohola, and again, I learned a little bit more. I honed my skills that much more with lipless crankbait fishing. And so it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. Sometime later, probably a few years later, maybe 5 years later, maybe even more, I found myself fishing with a buddy. He was actually someone who got me to do some seminars, some local seminars about fishing. Frank Waxmunski. Frank was instrumental to me having this YouTube channel. His encouragement over the years has been very helpful to me. Frank, if you're out there and you see this video, please contact me. I'd like to get back out on the water with you sometime soon. My contact information is right in the description of the video. So we went to Mautjunk Lake. And in the morning it was dead calm, and we were throwing small jigs, and we were catching some bass that way. But then we were going up lake, and we started to move up the lake, and I threw another lipless crankbait, and there's a good weed beds there too. Same way, I was just ticking the top, ripping them out of those weeds, and we crushed them on the lipless crankbait that day too. That was a brand that I don't have here with me at the moment, and I don't know what brand it was. There's so many out there, but they all catch fish. They all have a time and a place, I'm sure, and some sure work better than others. But you know, I've used these. These come from Jan's Netcraft. It's just a generic lipless crankbait. Catches plenty of fish. So to me, you know, you just kind of have to experiment with them and try them. Sometimes they like a one knocker. Sometimes they like that higher pitch rattle trap. Sometimes they like the lower pitch. Here's another good one. This is the, if I can get them free from my other bait here. This is the Strike King Red Eye Shad. Another real good bait. Now this one does well both ways. It actually has a decent shimmy on the fall, so you can fish it some vertically that way. But it also does very well ripping through weeds and fishing horizontally. And they've got some different size options too. For example, this is about 1/2 ounce here. Here's a 3/4 ounce. It's quite a bit bigger. So when you use the 3/4 versus the 1/2, when you want to get down a little deeper. So maybe you have some deeper weeds and you want to get to the tops of those weeds. That's when you use the 3/4. Shallower weeds, you want to get to the top of those weeds. That's when the 1/2 ounce becomes the better tool to throw. It's what really these things are. They're tools to allow you to get to the fish more effectively and catch them that way. Here's an interesting one. It's made by Rapala that I really have grown to like. It's called a Rapala Rip Rap, and this one, as you can see, it's got its own rattle in it. Here's another Rip Rap. This is a smaller one, and this is the last one I have like this. Hear that? That's an amazing rattle, isn't it? There is no rattle. And that's because when they first came out with this, Rapala came out with a silent version. And they only were around for about a year, maybe not even that. I don't understand why they stopped. They took them off the market. Most people don't even know they had a silent version. And I love this thing. This thing is a great vertical bait. It's great for going down and lifting it up and ripping it off the bottom and letting it fall again. This thing catches fish. And it's the last one I have without any rattles. It's the last silent one. I can't find them on eBay. I can't find them anywhere. So if anyone's out there that's got some of the Rapala Rip Raps silent, I'd be willing to buy them from you if you have them, because man, they do catch fish. And I know I could take these, I could take the regular Rip and Rap and drill holes in it and take the rattles out or fill them with glue. And believe it or not, I've done that. In fact, this lure that I just showed you, this generic one, if you look at the belly, you'll see it's got some red paint, and the back has red paint. I drilled a hole in the back and in the belly to get the lead out of there, to get the BBs out, and then I just filled it up with glue. And so this one doesn't have any BBs in it, so it's silent. So you can make them silent, but on this Rip and Rap, the darn thing is so thin across the back and belly, it actually would be hard to do that without really boogering up the bait. And I really think that's the advantage of this bait, is because it's so thin. Fish have more of a profile like this, bait fish. They're thin. They're not really fat like this. And so this profile seems to be right. I think it, it makes the right vibrations in the water. And the fish really do go after this thing. So we talk about a number of different lipless crankbaits here. I told you a little bit about my story, about how I learned how to fish them. I'll mention this one again. This is the Lucky Craft LV500. This is a really good up and down bait. You can even just kind of flop it off the bottom. Just have it there on the bottom. Just barely lift it so it barely comes off the bottom. A great cold water bait. This thing catches them very well. So this is I use for deeper applications. Doesn't work as well in the weeds though, because it goes down so effectively, and it would get into those weeds too much and be hard to rip out. That's where the Cordell Spot, a bait like this, a much lighter bait, or a rattle trap, or even the red eye shad from Strike King come into play. Those lures work much better for that shallow water bite. I'm fortunate today to still have a lot of these same baits that I know are fish catchers. I've lost some over the years. I used to have a Smokey Joe patterned Smokey Joe patterned Bill Lewis rattle trap, just like this one. And it was really beat up because it just caught so many fish. And the place I was catching all those fish on this bait was Nockamixon. I used to love to just get to the deep weed bed and weed edge and rip this bait along. It's a 3/4 ounce one. And this bait catches them out there, and I still do catch them on a lipless crankbait now and then on Nockamixon. But that one, I lost it years ago. It was the same weight and color as this, but there was something about that made it a lot better than this. Those fish loved it, and they just crushed it. And I lost it some time ago. I think I lost it to a toothy critter and a big muskie or something, and it's gone. And so you just have to hope that you find another one sometime, because those special baits, boy, they really make a difference in your fish catch rate. And lastly, I'll show you this one. This is a big Cordell Spot. It's actually a 1 ounce model, and normally it would have rattles in it, but this one doesn't. And it's because I drilled a hole in the back, took all the BBs out, and I actually filled it with plaster. Sometimes people will try and fill them with lead, but that would have made this too heavy. It's heavy enough. So I filled it with plaster. And this thing it looks great. It looks just like a big shad. I like throwing this out on points and just letting it go to the bottom. It has this little wiggle to it, like a dying flutter as it goes down. And then when I just rip it up, and then I just let it flutter back down. It looks like a dying shad. Great cold water bite. When those gizzard shad are stunned in the springtime and acting goofy, this is a really good imitation of that. And you can modify these baits to make them silent too. Personally, I feel that oftentimes the silent baits are more effective, at least in pressured waters, than the ones that make a lot of noise. And some days it doesn't matter. I find that on windy days it doesn't seem to matter as much. But if you're fishing calmer waters, I always like to go with a little bit more of a silent bait. And found that if I modify some of these lipless cranks, or if I'm able to find lipless cranks like this Rapala Rip Rap, You know, this one is already silent. I also know that the Strike King Red Eye Shad, they make this in a normal model. They also make it in a one knocker, so it just sounds like one BB or one large BB knocking back and forth. And they make this one, the Red Eye Shad, in a silent version too. So I know I can get this in a silent version, but I really want this one. I like this profile better for fishing vertically, up and down, jigging up and down. That's what I like to do with this bait. And so I'll continue looking, because if I can find them on eBay, I'll buy a few and I'll be ready to go. Well, I hope you found this video enlightening about how I learned to fish lipless crankbaits. I really do enjoy fishing them when that bite's on. It's just a blast. They just really nail it. And so it's a lot of fun. And if you like the video, hit that like button, share it with your friends. Remember here, you know, we're going to continue to keep putting out videos for you. They're going to be thought-provoking. They're going to be interesting. We're all about the art and science of fishing, especially the art and science of bass fishing. You know, there's the science behind it about what you can learn and how the fish behave and how there's seasonal patterns and what they do and how they react. And then there's the art, you know, and the art oftentimes is how you present the bait to the fish and figuring out what the patterns are and just how to get those fish to commit and bite. That's more of the art part. When you combine the science and the art, you become a better fisherman, and it becomes a whole lot more fun, and it makes more sense for you. And when your confidence goes up, you're going to catch more fish. It's really, in the end, it's all about confidence in fishing. It's amazing how much of a difference confidence makes. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, tell your friends about the channel, share it with your friends, and remember, we're certified Bassified, and may God bless your fishing endeavors.